Hi, I'm Robin.
And I'm Chris. Together we're the Gen X couple.
Hey guys.
Take one. Hello, everyone.
So today I wanted to talk about a story that Chris and I have heard many times as we've done this tour many times. But if you ever take the ghost tour in Plymouth, Massachusetts, you will hear the story. It's one of their main points of the tour. They talk about it in depth, but it's interesting. So I thought we would tell you guys about it today too. It's a Revolutionary War shipwreck that happened, as I said, in Plymouth, right in the harbor. And it's one that a lot of people in Massachusetts may have heard about, but might not know the full story behind. The ship was called the General Arnold, and it wrecked in Plymouth Bay in December of 1778 during a brutal winter storm. It happened literally within sight of Plymouth. It was right off the shore, and people on shore could actually see the stranded vessel, but they couldn't reach it because the weather was so bad. The wreck became one of the deadliest maritime disasters in the harbor, and even now, more than 2 centuries later, parts of the wreck are still buried in the sand offshore.
So the ship itself was a privateer, which is very common during the American Revolutionary War. A privateer was privately owned but authorized by the government to attack enemy shipping, and the owners would get a letter of marque allowing them to capture British merchant ships and bring them back as prizes.
So they were authorized pirates?
Yes.
Okay.
If they captured cargo, everyone on board shared the profits, and that's why privateering attracted large crews and experienced sailors. The General Arnold was a brigantine armed with about 20 guns and commanded by Captain James McGee.
I did let that go, because isn't it brigantine?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't buzz you for that. I want that noted. Captain McGee was already an experienced privateer captain by this point. His job on the voyage was to take the ship south toward the Caribbean, specifically the West Indies trade routes, where British merchant ships were carrying sugar, rum, molasses, and other valuable goods. Privateers would intercept those ships and bring them back to American ports. So when the General Arnold sailed out, the crew was hoping to make a profitable cruise. There were about 105 men on board, which included sailors, gunners, and officers.
So the ship left Boston Harbor on December 24th, 1778. So they were literally setting sail on Christmas Eve. The plan was to head south along the coast and then out to the Atlantic toward the Caribbean shipping lanes. But winter sailing in New England was always dangerous. Weather systems could form quickly, and once they did, there wasn't much a sailing vessel could do except to try outrun the weather or find shelter.
So not long after leaving Boston, the weather started getting worse. Captain McGee realized that they were heading straight into a serious winter storm. Instead of continuing south, he decided to try to find shelter in Plymouth Harbor. Plymouth was a familiar harbor to a lot of captains, and it seemed like the safest option at the time. The ship approached the harbor entrance near Gunnet Point, which marks the outer edge of the bay.
So by Christmas Day, the storm had intensified into a full winter gale. The ship dropped anchor in the harbor, hoping to ride it out. But the wind kept getting stronger, and the sea state got worse and worse. The anchors began dragging along the seabed. Once that started happening, the ship was basically at the mercy of the storm. The crew tried lowering additional anchors to stabilize the ship, but it didn't hold.
During the night of December 25th into early morning December 26th, the ship was pushed toward a dangerous sandbar known as White Flats. Eventually, the hull ran aground. At first, the crew hoped the ship would simply just sit there until the storm passed, but the waves kept pounding against the hull over and over again. Every time a wave hit it, the ship drove deeper into the sandbar.
So then, the ship started breaking apart. Water began flooding into the lower parts of the vessel. Captain McGee initially ordered the crew below deck, thinking the hull might hold long enough for the storm to pass. But as the water level kept rising, the men had to climb back up onto the deck and that's where they spent the next 36 hours.
And the conditions on deck were brutal. Freezing wind, blowing snow, and waves crashing over the ship. That must have been awful. I can't even imagine. The men were soaked with seawater and exposed to freezing temperatures the entire time. They tried to lash themselves to parts of the rigging or cling to whatever parts of the ship were still above water. Some of the crew tried to stay warm by huddling together.
The cargo holds also contained barrels of alcohol, and Captain McKee reportedly told the crew to pour liquor into the boots to help prevent frostbite.
Does that work?
I don't know.
I've never heard that before.
Instead, many of the sailors drank it.
Mm.
That might sound understandable given the situation, but alcohol actually lowers body temperature and makes hypothermia worse.
Hypothermia.
Some of the men became disorientated or passed out from the cold and exhaustion.
I will let that go. It's just disoriented. Meanwhile, people in Plymouth, Massachusetts could see the wreck, like we said earlier. The ship wasn't miles at sea. It was really close to the shorelines. But the problem was that the storm made rescue nearly impossible. Boats tried launching from the shore, but they were forced to turn back because the waves were too dangerous and the harbor was partially frozen. So the townspeople could see the stranded ship, but they just couldn't reach it.
So for nearly 2 days, the crew remained on the wreck as the storm continued. Waves kept breaking over the deck, ice formed on the rigging and rails. Eventually, the ship settled deeper into the sand until only part of the upper structure was visible above the water. Men began collapsing from exposure, others froze where they stood.
Yeah, and when the storm finally weakened on December 28th, that must have been a heck of a storm. My God.
Yeah.
But by the time the storm finally weakened, rescue boats were able to reach the wreck. What they found was pretty grim, you guys. Many of the sailors had died during the storm from hypothermia and exhaustion. The bodies were still on deck, frozen in place. Some were found clinging to ropes or rigging where they had tried to hold on during the worst of the storm.
So out of the 105 crew members who had sailed from Boston, around 70 died on the wreck during the storm itself. Several more were alive, but several severely injured from frostbite and exposure. The survivors were brought ashore to Plymouth, and unfortunately about 13 more later died from their injuries.
The bodies of the crew were recovered from the wreck and brought into town. Because there were so many victims and it was the middle of winter, the town had to organize a mass burial. The sailors were buried together in a large mass grave, and local residents helped recover and bury the bodies. At the time, it was considered one of the worst maritime disasters the town had ever seen. We've actually been to that spot on the ghost tour. They'll take you right there, to the spot where they think. We actually have a story. Well, at the end, we'll tell you the story, because that's where that thing happened. But we'll get to that.
So records from the time say the burial site was near the waterfront. Over the years, the exact location became less certain as the town grew and the landscape changed.
It's up on Burial Hill.
Yeah. But historically, it's known that the victims were placed in a shared grave rather than individual burials. The number of bodies and the winter conditions made individual graves impractical.
Yeah, there's no way they would have been able to dig all those in the winter, because up here in New England, the ground gets super hard. And they didn't have, bobcats or whatever they used, excavators. I don't know the name for those construction vehicles, but they wouldn't have been able to dig in the ground, is what I'm trying to say. And believe it or not, Captain James McGee survived the disaster. Some of the officers and crew were rescued alive, but the loss of so many men made the wreck notorious. Locally, the storm even became known as the McGee Storm after the captain of the ship.
And the wreck itself never fully disappeared. The General Arnold settled into the sandbar in Plymouth Bay, and over the years, shifting sand buried most of the structure, but parts of the ship remained underwater at the site, and divers have explored the location occasionally, and artifacts have been recovered from the wreck.
Yeah, so even though the ship sank back in 1778, the story is still connected to the landscape today. The sandbar where it ran aground is still there. The wreck site is still in the bay, and the mass grave of the sailors, like we said, is part of the local history in Plymouth.
Yeah, and it's one of those Revolutionary War stories that isn't about battles or armies, but how dangerous the sea can be. how a ship left Boston on Christmas Eve with more than 100 men hoping for a profitable privateering voyage, and instead it ran into a winter storm and ended up stranded just off of Plymouth Harbor.
Yeah, and one of the things that doesn't always get talked about enough with the wreck of the General Arnold is what happened actually after the storm ended and when the survivors were brought into town. So once the rescue boats finally reached the wreck in December of 1778, the first priority was getting the surviving crew members off of the ship. Many of them, of course, were suffering from frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion after being exposed on the deck for all that time. They were taken to private homes in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where local residents tried to warm them and treat their injuries. But you got to remember, this was the late 1700s, and there were no hospitals like the way we think of them today. So care for the injured usually happened in private homes back then.
Yeah, so in many cases, their hands and feet were badly damaged from the cold. Local residents and doctors did what they could, but medical knowledge was limited back then. And some of the men who were rescued alive unfortunately died in the following days from complications related to the exposure.
Yeah, and at the same time, crews began the difficult process of recovering the bodies of the sailors who had died on the shipwreck. The storm had left many of them frozen in place, like we had already mentioned. And when rescuers climbed aboard the ship, they found the bodies along rails, near the rigging, clustered together where groups of men had tried to stay warm. And the dead were brought ashore by boat and taken into town. And like I said, there were so many victims, they all got buried together.
And historical accounts say that several homes in Plymouth were used for this purpose. Residents allowed the bodies to be brought inside or placed in the outbuildings while preparations were made for burial.
Yeah, these were the dead people.
Yes.
Yeah.
And again, winter made everything more complicated. The ground was frozen, which made digging graves extremely difficult. Some of the victims were kept in barns or sheds, and others were reportedly laid out inside houses where they could be identified if possible.
Yeah, because the identification part was important because the General Arnold wasn't just made up of local sailors. Privateer crews were often drawn from many different places. Some were from Massachusetts, ports like Boston or Salem, but some others might have come from Rhode Island, Connecticut, or even further away. Privateering attracted experienced seamen who were willing to take the risk for the prize money.
So the local residents and officials participated in the burial, and the event made a strong impression on the community. Losing that many sailors in a single week so close to shore was something people talked about for decades afterward.
Yeah, and it is worth mentioning that the ship itself did continue to break apart in the harbor after the wreck. As we already said, it was driven deep into the sandbar during the storm, but over time, waves and currents just continued damaging the structure. Pieces of the ship were occasionally visible above the water in the years that followed the wreck. Eventually, most of it sank beneath the sand, though, in Plymouth Bay.
Yeah, and people sometimes recovered wood, iron fittings, or other materials from the wrecked ship, but because the General Arnold was buried in shifting sand on a shoal, a lot of it remained inaccessible.
Yeah, and another interesting detail about the crew is how typical they were of privateering voyages during the American Revolutionary War. Privateer crews were usually much larger than the crews of standard merchant ships, and that's because when a privateer captured a prized vessel, they needed extra sailors to operate the captured ship and bring it back to port. So a crew of around 100 men wasn't unusual for a privateer like this one.
And those crews were pretty diverse. You'd have seen seasoned sailors who had been working the Atlantic for years alongside younger men who were hoping to make quick money. Some were experienced gunners because privateers relied heavily on their cannons during engagements with enemy ships, and others handled like the rigging, the sails, and the navigation. A ship like the General Arnold functioned almost like a small floating community.
Yeah, and the captain, James McGee, had a lot of responsibility during a voyage like this. He had to navigate the ship, manage the crew, and make decisions about whether to pursue or avoid enemy vessels. In this case, his decision to seek shelter in Plymouth Harbor during the storm was probably the safest option available to him at the time. Unfortunately, the storm intensified so quickly that the ship was overwhelmed before it could safely anchor.
So over time, stories began circulating about strange sightings near the wreck site. Fishermen sometimes claim they heard unusual sounds coming from the water in that area, and especially on stormy nights there was noises, and others say lights occasionally appeared over the shoal where the ship had gone down.
Those kinds of stories are common around historic shipwrecks, especially ones involving a large number of deaths. In this case, in Plymouth, the wreck of the General Arnold became connected with local ghost lore. As we've said, we've heard the story many times. Some people have claimed to see shadowy figures or hear what sounds like voices carried over the water near the wreck site.
And because the wreck happened during a winter storm right after Christmas, the timing of the disaster added another layer to those stories.
That's true.
Local legends sometimes describe the sounds of wind and voices near the harbor during winter storms, with people saying it reminds them of the night the crew was stranded on the wreck.
Yeah. Now, whether someone believes in ghost stories or not, the wreck itself is very real and still part of the harbor. Modern technology has made it easier to study locations like this. Divers have occasionally explored the site, and marine archaeologists have mapped parts of the wreck area over the years.
And then when people fly drones over Plymouth Harbor, especially when the tide is low and the water is calm, they sometimes notice darker shapes or patterns beneath the surface of the water. Those shaped lines can be the General Arnold.
Yeah, the reason this happens is because wrecks change the way that the sand collects on the seabed. So even though most of the ship is buried, the structure underneath can still affect currents and sediment patterns. From above, those differences can show up as faint outlines or darker patches in the water.
So if you're flying a drone or even looking at aerial image of Plymouth Bay, under the right conditions, you might actually be seeing the imprint of a ship that wrecked during the Revolutionary War. But it's not like you can clearly see the entire ship sitting there, but the disturbance in the sand marks, that's where the location is settled.
Yeah, and considering that this happened way back in 1778, that's pretty amazing. The wreck site has been part of the harbor landscape for nearly 250 years. And the story of the ship, the crew, and the mass burial in town has remained part of local history ever since.
Yeah, and it's also like places that the Battle of Revolutionary didn't just happen in like Lexington or Yorktown. The ocean was a huge part of the war. And privateers like General Arnold were constantly sailing out of New England ports trying to disrupt British trade.
Yeah, and sometimes those voyages ended not in battle, but in storms like the one that affected Plymouth Harbor that December.
And that spot has been marked for over 200 years.
Yeah. One thing that comes up when people talk about the wreck of the General Arnold is the local folklore that developed over the years. Shipwrecks almost always end up surrounded by ghost stories, and especially when there's a lot of deaths involved. I feel like I already said that, so why don't we...
Let's talk about our experience.
Yeah, we should talk about our experience. I think it's time now.
So set the stage.
Okay, so we were on a ghost tour in Plymouth, and it was Colonial Lantern Tours. I'm not even sure if that company still runs. We left from the John Carver Inn, which is near Burial Hill in Plymouth.
We were with
my sister Tara and her husband Phil.
Yep.
It was just the four of us. I don't know if other people canceled, didn't show up, or it was only the four of us that booked that night, but it was only the four of us on the tour, plus the tour guide, who was an older lady. I don't even know. She was older than us at the time, although we're probably the age she was at the time now. But, but anyway, she was older than us. I'd say she was somewhere, maybe like late 50s, early 60s. We're not that old, by the way, yet, so... Just saying.
And it was a dark night.
Yeah, it was a dark night. The tour left probably, 8 o'clock? I don't even know. I think it left at like 8 from the John Carver Inn. And we walked and she was telling stories. And the first stop on that tour was Burial Hill, which is right behind the John Carver Inn. So we just walked up past the church where the pilgrims prayed, up 50,000 stairs into Burial Hill. And she told us several stories in Burial Hill. And then in the back is the area where they believed all the men from the shipwreck were buried in the mass grave. So we get to that area and it's pitch black. And we had lanterns. We each had a lantern and that was it. So the tour guide was talking, telling her story. Then all of a sudden...
Well, she was talking, she was telling the story, and then she paused. And then as soon as she paused, My brother-in-law, Phil, opened up his camera case,
And
which
the
was
Velcro ripped, like,
Velcro ripped
that was the only sound in the silence.
in the whole cemetery. And our tour guide screamed.
She screamed like a horror film, which made us scream because
Yes.
we thought she saw something behind us.
Yes.
But she was really screaming at the sound of the Velcro. And we realized what had happened within like several seconds. And it was hilarious. And we still talk about that. We still talk about that to this day. It was so funny. But yeah, that was our story. It wasn't a ghost. It was.
I bet you if we ever go on that tour again and we get her, she'll know exactly who we are.
Probably.
She's like, you're the people that scared me out of my wits.
I feel like when you take the ghost tour, a lot of them will tell you they've seen things in Burial Hill. A lot of them will tell you that. And it does feel heavy in that area. I will admit that. Like, you can tell. Like, even that whole cemetery, I feel like it's beautiful. There's a beautiful view of the harbor, and it's just the old headstones. It's beautiful if you ever want to go up there and take a walk. But it is heavy over in that corner.
It is.
And we scared the life out of that poor woman.
We did.
Oh, my God. It was funny, though. She did laugh after when she realized what had happened. But anyway, that's the story. It's a wild story. It's a terrible, heartbreaking story. And it's a very true story. And if you have a drone and you take pictures over Plymouth Harbor, send me a picture. There are some on Google Images, too, if you want to go back and take a look. But there you have it. And we'll be back next week. And thanks. Check social media. The end.
See you later, alligator.
In a wild crocodile.